Welcome everyone to the Open University's GCRN webinar series. As we said just now, the event is being recorded, so we can make it available afterwards. But we will edit out the Q&A bit in case people don't want their names identified on it. We'll put your cams on if you want to, but just keep your mic off for the moment. We've also decided to remove the chat function from the webinar series, so that we can recreate as best as possible the feeling of being in a room together with everyone being able to pay attention to what the speaker is saying, without distractions and parallel conversations going on in the chat box. So I hope that will make it a more focused event. So I'm absolutely delighted that we have Simon Fanshawe to present to us today. He'll be known to many of you as one of the co-founders of Stonewall, and he was chair of Sussex University in 2007 to 2013, and actually awarded an OBE for his services to higher education. But in more recent years, Simon's become a broadcaster and an author and a diversity consultant. He set up his own company called Diversity by Design, which supports organisations to meaningfully diversify their senior leaders and design out bias in hiring and promotion with clients. And that his organisation works across all sectors, including higher education. Simon has just published a book called The Power of Difference, which I'm reading. Yes, I'm holding it up as well, Simon. It's a really good book. I'm thoroughly enjoying it, and you know, he really is. It's what I like about it is it's so clear. It's so clear, it's written in very direct language. It's very engaging with lots of examples, and it really is about the complexity of diversity and inclusion, and the kind of relationship between those two concepts, which often get rather merged into each other, I think, with lots of kind of practical ideas and solutions. I do really recommend it, and you know what I really like about it as well is it keeps the focus on diversity and difference, and how the fact of diversity and difference shouldn't be denied. It can't be denied, but it shouldn't be denied, because it's actually a very healthy part of organisations to work with difference and diversity. So I really recommend it. It's a wonderful read. So the title of Simon's talk is Safe Spaces or Psychological Safety. Simon, take it away. Thank you.
Well, firstly, I'm slightly rather taken aback by those very kind words. Thank you very much indeed. It was great fun writing it. All the work stopped on appropriately Friday, March the 13th, 2020. And so I thought, well, what shall I do? And they'd asked me to write something, so I wrote the book. And I know you're academics, so you spend most of your time doing this rather well. But for those of us who are not academics, that was great fun. It was on the tip of my tongue, and that's, I guess, what I'll be talking about, is why was it on the tip of my tongue. Just to start off by saying, and really reflecting on what you just said there, this notion, the reason it's called The Power of Difference is because its starting point, I suppose, is that the only thing that we have in common as human beings is that we're all different. And we can never see the world or experience the world or go through the world in the same way that anybody else can. And that it's the journey to try and understand that in the certain knowledge that you never will, which is really one of the great joys of life. It is the human challenge, and the fact that we never will understand each other is the human condition. And for me, that's the fundamental question that lies underneath this issue of diversity and inclusion. We wouldn't talk about either of them if we weren't different. If we were all the same, there would be no need to think about the practicalities of needing to make sure that we are including people. If we were all the same, we wouldn't get the sort of benefit that I argue we would get by combining our differences. So that notion of difference is quite fundamental, and I don't know where it comes from in me. I suspect psychologically it comes, as I say in the introduction to the book, from the fact that my parents used to argue a lot, and they argued constantly in a very volatile sort of way, and then they always made up, and then they always said to me, and we love you. And I think that when I got to Sussex, I then began to realise that's what posh people call dialectic. So you see, I suddenly realized that this kind of clash and production of solutions, maybe that's where I took it from psychologically, I don't know. But I have a belief in politics that what you do in politics is you try and put together the broadest range of alliances in pursuit of a common aim. And I will use that framework and some of the lessons from early days in Stonewall when we actually achieved something to try and explain that. To make a couple of distinctions, though, on the way in, diversity flows from fundamentally a kind of human rights notion and an understanding of discrimination. And so consequently, a significant element of the development of diversity has been around discrimination and what I've taken to calling the diversity deficits. We can identify them. Data tell us, both qualitative and quantitative, what the experiences of people in organizations and so on. And you can tell by, we know where women are, we know how well or not women are promoted or developed in organizations, etc., etc., etc. So data can tell us a lot about the diversity deficits. But one of the problems with just approaching this question around the deficits, well, there are two problems. One is that you get stuck into a mode that becomes about numbers. So CEOs say to me things like, and still they say these things like, we need more women. And I always say to them, well, OK, let's pop out into the high street and get 6 assaulted. And they go, I don't mean that. And I go, well, I know you don't mean that. But what do you mean? Because until you can articulate why a different combination of men and women in your organization is going to enhance your ability to achieve the goals you've set yourself, then we don't know what we're doing and what we're looking for. So one of the problems is it traps organizations into a deficit model, which then becomes just about the numbers, and then people set targets and they just aim for the targets without learning along the way. The other thing is that it also then perceives by and large minorities in terms only of deficit and discrimination. And the danger of that is that you then set up your staff networks and all these things. And the ultimately what happens is there's a weaponization of victimization that happens. And you can see that in all sorts of debates at the moment. You can see it in the debates around race, where there is this constant incantation of a sentiment that expresses the experience of Black people in Britain or America, particularly in terms of the relationship with the police, whatever. What it doesn't do is it doesn't then make defeating racism something about the power and brilliance and contribution that people can make. And the example I always use of this is if you think about the way in which that, seeing people who have a let's call it minority status, seeing them in terms of the asset that they can bring is a very powerful thing to do. And the example I always use is the curb drops on, those little slopes on the edge of the curb, which were invented originally after the Second World War, mainly for the use of veterans. They were popularized by a fantastic man called Ed Roberts, who he was an extraordinary man. He did an undergraduate and then a postgraduate MA at Berkeley. And he had polio when he was 14, and he slept in an iron lung, and he breathed by using a mechanism called frog breathing, which is a way of forcing air down into your lungs using your neck muscles. Remarkable man, went on to be the father of independent living in the States. My point about him, which is so remarkable, is that he understood that whilst the mobility of people in wheelchairs and such like were needed to be, but actually what happened was that the number of people who are in wheelchairs who use those curb drops is tiny, actually, compared with the huge population of people who use them, wheelbarrows, bicycles, suitcases on wheels, cycles, trolleys, buggies, the lot. So what you get there is this wonderful idea that actually what's seen as a deficit, disability, actually becomes an asset, which in the end changed global architecture, street architecture across the world. So this asset idea. So one is to say, don't get trapped in the deficits, but understand them precisely. They're not just necessarily made up of these big groups. And I'll get onto this in a minute, but the kind of victimization idea obscures the need to understand discrimination when it's happening, but it also can obscure the mechanism that underlies what are discriminatory outcomes, but they may not be discriminatory in intent. By which I mean, if you look at the FTSE 100, I counted the top 300 people in the FTSE 100, which is the chair, the chief exec, and the chief finance officer. And I did this about 4 years ago, and there are more white men called John, David, and Andrew in those 300 jobs than there are women and people of colour. Now, you'll be glad to know there's a bit of progress, because I did it again for the book, and you have to include the Michaels to make that work now, so hurrah. But my point being is, why is that happening? Now, if you take a deficit view, it's racism, sexism, and so on and so forth. Actually, what the research suggests is it's a much different mechanism. That's the outcome is discriminatory, but the intent that's going on, it's about what people value in the people they want to put in those jobs. It's a confirmation. It's much more affection towards inside group than it is a hostility to outside group that drives that discriminatory outcome. So the deficits are important. We need to understand discrimination, but we also need to understand it in detail. The dividends is the other half of diversity. So you've got the diversity deficits and the diversity dividends, and it's important to try and see those two things as separate. They're clearly related, but to give them separate focus. Because once you've unblocked the talent, then you can start to think about how do we combine it in the right way to achieve what it is we want to achieve. So that's one distinction. Second distinction, which flows again from this deficit idea, is that the staff group idea, the minority group idea, and this is where we get on to the sort of questions of safe spaces and clashes. The danger is that companies and organizations set up these groups and then assume they have a single voice. And not only that, but people within those groups frequently set themselves up as gatekeepers. So what you have is you have the LGBTQIA blah, blah, blah plus voice, the black voice, the BAME voice. And 2 points in that. There was a wonderful conference in 2020 called #BAMEover. And they said that the quote was, I can give you the quote because it's actually rather marvelous, because they were a group of largely younger people, actually, who got together at this conference to say, actually, we don't accept. They said, we do not want to be grouped into meaningless collective term or reduced to acronyms. We are African diaspora people. We are Southeast and Southeast Asian diaspora people. We are Middle East and North African people. We are ethnically diverse. We are people who experience racism. So beware the big group, because the assumption of a single voice is very, very damaging to this idea of creating spaces that are safe for disagreement rather than safe from disagreement, which is the way I express psychological safety. Similarly, this acronym LGBTQ, I mean, I always say to people, they've turned one of the great passions of my life, which was lesbian and gay equality, into a slightly secure password on the internet. What's happened here is that we've got this mad group, and you think, well, what is that measuring? What is that describing? LGBTQIA+. This is a group of people who appear to have in common something like a sexual dissonance. What would it be? A sexual nonconformity? Is that what it is? But actually, the truth of it is, it doesn't describe anything. It describes a very loose tribe of people, an intersecting set of Venn diagrams, if you like, that don't all of them intersect at all. And they've been lumped together. And actually, there isn't a single voice, as you well know, precisely because of the need you've had to set up this network. So that's another danger. So we have to be very careful of the distinction between group disadvantage, which we can measure and say, what happens to women, what happens to gay people, what happens to trans people, what happens to, black people, whatever. We can measure the disadvantage qua group. But what happens then is it gets confused with the individual aspiration, talent, and ambition of the particular people in that group. So that's another distinction, is the individual voice, and then this group disadvantage. And a third distinction would be that one of the contexts in which we're living at the moment is where the subjective has become triumphant. So people, for instance, talk about, I feel unsafe. And the question is, okay, but are you unsafe? There's a material reality to being unsafe. There may be an emotional reality to feeling unsafe, but actually that subjective idea has now become very, very powerful. The danger for us, particularly in academia, but it's in all organisations, is that you can't run organisations on the basis of subjective experience and impressions. But what you do have to do is hear them. So what I always say to people is, look, we have to understand the subjective and we have to hear, not to respond, but we have to listen to hear. And then we have to find a collective process which finds a solution or resolution to the problem that they're showing up. In other words, there's a sense of due process that needs to be followed in some sort of way. So I'm not saying that we don't hear and listen to the subjective. We need to, and we need to understand the power dynamics within that. So when women started Me Too, the slogan was all women must be heard. Absolutely right. That got to the heart of what was going on, was women were reporting those experiences of sexual harassment and rape and so on, and they weren't being heard. They weren't being listened to by campus authorities or the police or whoever. The slogan slightly elided at one stage to all women must be believed. That clearly cannot be true. I mean, just on a logical basis, it cannot be true. People lie. So we have to be careful of accepting the subjective as the definition of the experience. So when we come to the definition of things like racism or homophobia or transphobia or sexism, what people are doing at the moment is they're taking their own particular personal experience. They're venerating that, if you like. It has an almost sacred idea that you can describe your own experience and that creates the world in which you live. So I would make a distinction between the subjective experience and then in organizations or teams or groups of people, the reaching of collective solutions which understand those subjective experiences but don't just take them as read. So where does this get us to? It gets us to a position where this notion of diversity and inclusion is now being seen, rather than being about difference, it's got to a difficult stage where it does certain things. So it says things like, right, we've all got unconscious bias. We're all prejudiced. We've learned biases. But these are things that are in our brain. We have no control over them. They leap out. And ultimately, if you go down that route, what you end up with is a very peculiar idea, which is the notion of the relationships being black and white being inevitably and unchangingly between the powerful and the subjected. And you will have just, I don't know whether you noticed my husband walking by, going back to work there, but my husband is Nigerian. And if you ask him about the significance of race, for instance, in our relationship, he will say, well, it doesn't have a significance in our relationship. Now, I suspect that's because he's African. But I'm a white liberal, so I go when he said that, oh, God, no, you sure? I must have, you know? And so what we've done is the subjective has started to create this single voice, this single way of thinking about the relationship between black and white people, which means that A, there's not that dialogue around the shift, the change that we can make together. We get set into patterns of power relations, which appear to be immovable. And that means that, therefore, when you disagree with people, what that is interpreted as by a range of people is not disagreement, but it's hostility or it's enmity. And disagreement gets weaponized then in order to put you the other side of a particular line. So that's problematic. The staff networks then start to reflect that, and you then start to get this idea of the single voice. So you have literally got at the moment staff. I mean, I know one in the Ministry of Defence. There are lots of them around. The one in the Ministry of Defence has literally expelled the people who do not agree with what one would broadly call gender ideology. And they won't have speakers and they won't have discussions and contributions from those people because they've decided that there is a gay voice. A lesbian LGBT voice, there is an LGBT community and so on and so forth. And then there's other group of people who are kind of the wrong kind of gays. And you can see this all the way through this notion of diversity. So the danger is that instead of being fundamentally about difference, it's become a tool of conformity, a set of rules by which you have to observe in order to enter this hallowed world of diversity, which has now been, you know, drowned in academicized verbiage like, you know, privilege, structural this and structural that, intersectionality, and all these kind of things, which people down the street, I mean, no one talks like that. You know, if you walk down the street, people wouldn't talk like that or understand that if you started talking to them about it. Whereas if you say to people, you know, this, you know, do you know what a microaggression is? They go, no. If you say to them, do you know about, that thing when, men just drip, 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 and they go on making those annoying comments, and you just go, every day it goes on and eventually it gets to you. They go, yeah. Well, that's what a microaggression is. I mean, it's an everyday harm, none of which is significant, but as a total, it becomes very, very demoralizing. So, we've got to return this, I think, to 2 or 3 fundamental ideas. One of them is that the subjective experience cannot be king or queen. Secondly, that actually these groups of people do not have a single voice. They do not have a single experience other than the extent to which and when they experience discrimination. And thirdly, that what underpins all of this is the need to return to dialogue. And that's when I get to this idea of safe spaces and so on and so forth. There is a very good book called The Fearless Organization, written by a terrific person called Amy C. Edmondson. And Amy is the sort of doyenne, really. She's a Harvard professor, and she's the doyenne, really, of psychological safety. And early days when she was studying this, she started with her team to look at whether there was a correlation between psychological safety and in surgical teams and medical errors. She would define psychological safety as the expectation that people will speak. In other words, it's not exceptional, it's not speaking up or sticking your head above the parapet, but actually it's the expectation that everybody speaks and challenges, which is what creates psychological safety. So they did this huge data set, and they looked at tons of surgical teams, and they did indeed come up with a correlation. And there is a correlation. In their first data cut, they saw there was correlation between medical errors and psychological safety. But the thing was, it was the opposite of what they thought. Psychologically safe teams made more errors. And they couldn't work out what on earth this was about. And they spent months, literally months, cutting the data and looking at it again. And then Amy had a moment and she suddenly realized something. So she asked a few supplementary questions, and then they discovered it's not that psychologically safe surgical teams make more mistakes. They report more mistakes, which means they learn from them, which means that in those teams, nurses do challenge surgeons and overcome that huge status barrier which exists in medicine, and so on and so forth. And she's just done a subsequent bit of work, interestingly, around the functioning of diverse teams. And there is this kind of cliche that diverse teams produce better results. Well, they don't actually, unless they're well managed. Homogenous teams produce better results because it's much easier to communicate with people who are like you. But psychologically safe diverse teams produce much better results. In other words, if you create an atmosphere and a culture in which people speak up and are disagreement and deviating from the group view and so on and so forth is not penalized socially or in terms of your status or reward or whatever. In fact, it's rewarded. Then actually you create a different kind of context. And that is one of the things, that is where we have got to at the moment, is there is an absence of dialogue in politics. And I think the Stonewall situation, to look at that particularly, the Stonewall situation is a product of something. They may have driven an institutional capture or institutional capture in certain ways, but actually they're a product of this refusal, this crisis in dialogue at the moment that we've got in politics, which Jonathan Haidt, the American psychologist, has just written a piece for The Atlantic. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called Why is America So Stupid? But he dates it he wrote The Coddling of the American Mind as well. And he dates it from 2014. And which is the year on which Facebook introduced the like button, and Twitter introduced the retweet button. And so what he's arguing basically is that opinion these days and views are expressed in order not to meet with other people, exchange with other people and reach solutions or dialogue, but they're done in order to burnish people's individual reputations. So we're in a situation now where actually the nature of discussion and debate, the very idea of it itself is as you know, And I just finish on a story about Stonewall, which is why I'm so deeply, deeply disappointed. In fact, something happened yesterday, which was a piece I've been asked to write, and which the organisations that I've been asked to write it about for the Sunday Times simply won't collaborate with me. And it's definitely because it's me. You know, they just won't give interviews or whatever. Anyway, 2003, cast your minds back. Stonewall did a big survey and asked lesbians and gays what we wanted. What do you want? And obviously, you know, we said musical theatre. But apart from that, what people said were their priorities were all the things that would flow from our relationships were they to be legally recognised in some way. Visitation rights in hospital, next of kin rights, pensions, inheritance, you know, all that bread and butter stuff that heterosexuals took for granted in the context of civil or religious marriage. So then we surveyed the political landscape, and the government, whilst being very supportive, I mean, by that stage, they'd done a huge amount to equalise the age of consent and remove the military ban and so on and so forth. They were very, very nervous about the idea of taking on marriage. Mainly because the second reason, which is that the church thinks it owns marriage. In fact, all the churches think they own marriage, and they don't. It's a civil institution. But actually, we would have had huge problems in the Commons and the Lords. And the third thing was that lesbians thought that marriage was part of the patriarchy, and they didn't want gays volunteering. So there was no alliance to put together around equal marriage. So Angela Mason, the then brilliant chief executive of Stonewall, was aware in France and Holland of these rather weaker ideas of sort of civil-ish partnerships. And we imported them, wrote some legislation that were almost unanimously embraced by people. And the reason that was that if you said to ordinary people, look, you realise that if you're gay and your partner's in hospital, that you can't visit them in the same way that a family can. You can't talk to their doctor. You can't get access to their medical records. People go, what? Seriously? You go, yeah. So people, of course, they embraced it. And two things happened. One is they embraced it. This vast range of people embraced it, even quite a lot of the churches, although they said you can't have them in our buildings. But the other thing was that we all said at the time, everybody will call them weddings. And sure enough, they did, because actually they looked very like weddings. So when, Uncle Joe came to, gay nephew's wedding, he wasn't any longer concerned that nephew was a wolf. He was now concerned about whether the nephew was happy. The question changed. 10 years later, gay marriage. Now, we could have walked up and down outside the House of Commons with signs demanding equal marriage, and we would have been repelled. But actually, by putting together that broad alliance around a common objective, through our differences, there were a huge alliance of people in that campaign, but recognising our differences and through our differences, collaborating on that single defined objective, which was to deliver to lesbians and gays the stability and the rights and responsibilities that would flow from having a legitimately and legally recognised relationship, we actually did deliver the outcome. We delivered what lesbians and gays wanted. And if you look at Stonewall since 2015, it has won nothing. And my contention to you is the reason it's won nothing is it does not know any longer. It betrayed its own legacy. It is using the credibility that it built to try and do something else. And that is to enforce on people an ideology and a form of language and a compliance with the demands of people, rather than negotiating a broad alliance around some agreed objectives. I have no idea what Stonewall's objectives or demands on Parliament or the law actually are any longer. Everyone they've made public, they've lost. They've changed their position the whole time, but fundamentally what they've done is they've betrayed that legacy. They betrayed the legacy which achieved all the changes that we achieved up to 2014 with gay marriage. And that's the source of my terrific sadness.
Thank you, Simon. Sorry, I assume that was a full stop.
That was a full stop.
Thank you.
Came to a shuddering end there.
No, a lot of things to think about just at that final point you were making. Thank you. What I'd like to do is invite questions or comments. It doesn't have to be a question.
Yes, please just comment.
Yeah, a comment. So what we'll do is if you can put your hand up, and then I'll try and call people in order. So you use the reaction button to put your hand up.
And please
course,
do, because we don't want to sit in silence for half an hour. Come on, children. Come on, play nice.
I see somebody. Alison.
Alison.
Would you, can you unmute yourself? Have you got the power to do that? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. That was completely fascinating, and I was just gripped, and it makes me want to go out and read a book, I have to say. But I do feel a little bit of an imposter, like a stranger in this environment here. I'm very heterosexual, and I'm very STEM in my academia, in that I'm a pharmacist and I approach everything from that. I was fascinated to hear you to talk about safe space in terms of medical safety, because obviously as a pharmacist, that's, we look for the highest rates of error for the safest systems. In that sense, it's just part of what we do and part of what we try and inculcate into our student bodies. And I'm not sure there's a clear question attached to this, but I just wondered about that. How have we got in this situation where there is not that debate? What were the drivers behind it? Where did it come from?
It's very, very interesting. I was asking some people last night that I was with, how did we get, not just how did we get here, but also why has it been that so many people have kind of bought into something which actually they probably don't believe in, but they feel they've got to go along with? That is the peculiar question as well. How we've got here, I do think, is a function of bigger politics. I think that Jonathan Haidt's essay is really interesting in this idea that actually one of the things that social media has done is in creating this ability to just like something. In other words, in a sense, virtue signal. There's nothing wrong with virtue signaling. It can start a conversation, but unless it actually starts a conversation, but people are not doing it for that reason. They're doing it to get more followers, to get whatever. And there was a story yesterday in one of the papers that Prince Harry is the whatever the hell he is for some therapy organization in the States. And this is an app, and it's alleged by some of the, so it's a therapy app. And what happens is a bit like Tinder, apparently, you sort of swipe right for bedwetting and swipe left for nail biting. You know what I mean? You find the right therapist for you. But then one of the complaints of these 2,000 therapists is that he's being paid a ton of money. They're not being paid well enough. And it was rumored that their pay would become dependent on the extent to which the clients liked them. And you experienced that a bit with the National Student Survey. Now,
oh God.
Yeah. So, and this idea that actually, you kind of got to be liked is a very peculiar one, but it is part of the whole trajectory. So I think there is one thing, which is this idea that people are not debating, they're taking positions. And that's, and that's got to be challenged. People find, and it's very difficult to challenge that stuff. It's hard work sticking your hand up saying, I don't agree. So I think that's one thing. I think there's been some very sophisticated campaigning, particularly around the trans stuff, which has been deliberately and explicitly to infiltrate organizations. And there's a kind of this idea of be nice. We ought to be kind to people, be nice to people. I think there's quite a theme underneath this, which is, and it certainly was true a few years ago, I think maybe less so now, but actually a lot of senior people think, oh God, we got it so wrong with the gays, we better not get it wrong again. So it was kind of snuck in under this be kind to people, but actually, pronouns and all that stuff, oh, it's just showing respect. Actually, there's a whole bunch of stuff that flow from it, which people don't realize that they were getting into. So I think there was a sense of we didn't know that this was happening. I think there's partly this subjective thing, this constant projection of yourself as if, life and everything is about making your own individual choice in the market. And you kind of construct your own world through language. So I think there are a lot of forces in there that are making it. But I go back to this idea of the subjective, really. Anybody, what do you think? How do you think we got there?
I suppose, I mean, I'm sort of pre-social media generation, basically. You know, I'm a late arrival to all this. This wasn't there when I grew up, and it feels like almost a combination of things, really. As an educationalist, I look at our education system and the way that's structured and the way students are received and how they respond when they come to university, where that environment no longer exists. So I think there's a whole, I don't know, it just seems so multifactorial that I really couldn't begin to tease it apart, really. Can you blame it all on a like button? Probably not. No.
No, you can't. I think the like button again is I mean, if you think of some of the big forces, so you think of why did the civil rights groups set up around black civil rights to start with, and women's groups set up, gay groups? That was largely a response to the fact that neither the organised left or the right was interested in us.
Yeah.
So therefore we started our own organisation. So that's one factor that's going on, I think. So then you get into this autonomous organisation thing and the idea of a single voice, which actually makes some sense when you're campaigning early on, because you do share, you know, that kind of insult to your liberty and rights. You share that, actually. So your individual differences, in a sense, are submerged. So I think that's one bit of the picture. I think a second bit of the picture is this idea that choice in the market creates individuality. So, you know, people think that, you know, they buy a Louis Vuitton rip-off bag or they wear Calvin Klein underwear and they think that speaks to their individual style. Actually, it doesn't. It speaks to the style of 40 million people who wear Calvin Klein underwear. But we've bought into this idea that you can, choice in the market gives you individuality. And I think the triumph of therapy has reversed the collective happiness idea. So the idea now is all well-being and happiness is always seen in individual terms now. So politics has kind of been washed through therapy. And so instead of the personal being political, the political has become personal now. So, I mean, I think those are some of the forces that have produced this hyper individualism, which then turns into this kind of extreme subjectivity.
Which kind of links to the whole capitalist society and the way capitalism is run in terms of that individualism. Well, yes. And I certainly recognise it as an older woman being rejected by capitalism as I'm no longer suitable to be marketed to. Yes. And you cease to exist.
But equally, you see, the older market now is growing, because actually capitalism is sufficiently clever to realise that actually that is
just me at last.
I mean, I would say that I'm a kind of left-wing capitalist, really. I'm not. In other words, I'm not going to say we should all become massive collectivists, because I don't want a tractor and a dictatorship about the paintings we see. So there's a tension there. But I think the key thing is in all of that is that if you can create your own world through the language you use, rather than describe the world through the language that you use, that leads you to a position where actually anybody disagreeing with you becomes an attempt to destroy your world.
There are other hands up.
Can I just, yeah, thank you. I was just going to say, if we take Levy, Rosie and John in that order, why don't you speak in that order, and then Simon, you can pick up on anything you like from what they have to say. So Levy, do you want to speak?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that, Simon. Really interesting. Apologies if I missed you saying this, because I did have to attend my dog's basic needs for a small part of your talk. But I just wanted to reflect slightly on the role of the ally in all of this.
I didn't, but go on.
Okay, great. Because I absolutely agree with what you said about minority status in terms of how we've shifted in thinking about minority status. And I absolutely agree with this idea of kind of treating large groups of people as a hive mind. But I think that actually the biggest shift that we've really seen is around this concept of the ally, which when I used to work at Stonewall myself as well back in the 90s, there was never this concept of an ally then. I mean, obviously there were allies in practice, there were people who were with us and supported us, but there wasn't this kind of inflated sense of being an ally. And I think, so a friend of mine, Karina Cohn, a transsexual in the US, did this brilliant podcast where she talked about the role of allyship and basically said that when you're an outsider speaking on behalf of a group, what you're effectively doing doing is not only treating that group as a hive mind, but you are putting your thumb on the scale of the conversation, and you're tilting the debate in favour of the position and argument that you already share, and absolutely denying people within that community the ability to speak for themselves. And I think that the reason I think this is important, my final point, is that what you're saying about dividend versus deficit speaks to managers of organisations, and it speaks to minority groups themselves. But I'm not sure it really tackles this fundamental problem that people are getting something out of speaking for groups that are not their own. And I think that's one of our big challenges, is how we distract or move away from this idea that the most powerful thing you can do with your time is speak for a group that's not your own, because I think that's what's causing a lot of the problems. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting point. I mean, I think that it does. I think I think it goes back to this idea that actually what people do is, instead of making an active change in the status of those minority status groups, what you do is you ally yourself with them and say, you know, and the classic, there's a bit of research that I included in the book. Did I mention I've got a book? Anyway, so there's a bit in there which is really interesting research about flexible working. So one of the things that this bit of research uncovers is the idea that if a company offers flexible working, or an organisation, typically women take it more than men. And it's based on the idea that women particularly experience a conflict between work and family that men do not experience. So there's a dominant narrative about that. Actually, what the research showed was that actually men feel that tension every bit as strongly between work and family. We just deal with it differently. So what happens is that we then put ourselves, you know, hunter-gatherer and all that, we put ourselves in the position of staying at work, you know, working hard, and we give ourselves the narrative of supporting the family. The woman then takes the flexible working. So what is supposed to actually enhance the woman's opportunities precisely plays into a narrative which starts to deny the woman's opportunities. And the men, back to your point, and the men then have the luxury of saying, oh, I know how women feel. It must be really, really difficult. And that's exactly the circle you're talking about. So I fully concur with you. I think it's really interesting. I always say about allies, and I get into terrible trouble about this, but I always say, you know, they say, well, gay, you know, I'm a gay, I'm an LGBT ally. And I always feel like, I feel like a slightly unwell person in a hospital being pushed around in a wheelchair by a big, burly, helpful heterosexual. And I just kind of think, I don't really need an ally, thanks very much. What I'd love you to do is just shut up and get on with it. You know, come with me. Don't give yourself a name, love. Just, you know, and by the way, don't park your tank half on my lawn, because that's really what you're doing. It's the modern equivalent of Some of My Best Friends Are Black. Isn't it? I think.
Absolutely. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Rosie, would you like to say something?
Sorry, I can't.
You have unmuted. You are.
I have unmuted. Sorry. Thanks so much, Simon. Really, really interesting talk. I'm thinking about this in a really practical sense. I think there used to be an idea of safe spaces in the arts being, you know, some kind of, almost it had like a sacred kind of connotation that when we were all together in a studio creating art, we had to look at the heights and depths of humanity and find ways to express them together using everything we've got. And it seems like there's also been this really strange kind of version of the idea of like bringing your whole self to work, because if you work with artists in a creative sphere, then what you're bringing is yourself, but you have a discipline and you have a training and you have a concept of why it's there, as opposed to a kind of individuated idea of the self that then has to be imposed upon everyone else while in a workspace that seems to kind of create a very censorship atmosphere. And I just wondering, like, you know, what are actual practical hints? I was thinking about like putting together something like a charter of agreement that we uphold freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but we also really think about the role of art in society. Like, what's it there for? What's it there to do? How we have to be able to question. If we can have flexible bodies, we must have flexible minds. And how can we nurture within this culture, you know, a resilience that you can have that ability to argue opposite sides, like you do at a school debating society. And you know, I'm just sort of thinking like there are still hierarchical problems. You know, it's all about kind of looking at everything through this prism of power and oppression. Yet at the end of the day, a director or a choreographer needs to be able to ask people to do things and get something done by a deadline.
Yeah, I think 2 or 3 things to say. Firstly, I've just realised who you are, and I am absolutely unbounded in my admiration for what you wrote after what happened to you. So I just wanted to, I'm really glad to have the chance to say that. It was just an extraordinary piece of writing that you wrote about you and your body and your sense of womanhood. So I love that. So it's really nice to meet you. Hello. The second thing to say is that I find it curious because what you say seems to be so much of the essence of art. It does seem to me, I mean, theatre would be the thing that I could not do without. And I feel that, and my favourite playwrights are actually Miller and Ibsen and you know, that sort of, you know, Eugene O'Neill. And the reason particularly actually Miller and Ibsen is that I find that the theatre somewhere where I can go and be treated to the experience of things that I don't understand, don't agree with, don't know about, in a space that contains them precisely for the purpose of containing and exploring them, so that when you go back out, you can take them out into the world. And that can be true of a dance experience, it can be true of a site-specific experience, it can be true of all sorts of different kinds of cultural experience. And it seems to me, of their essence, those experiences are about exploring the deep and dark and difficult, and that's what we're there to do. So the idea that people can feel unsafe, the idea that you need a trigger warning or some such, I mean, the whole point is not to be triggered. The whole point is not to be warned about triggering. The whole point is to be, you know, in some way stimulated and whatever. So I think at the essence of it is that. And so I think that what one has to go on doing is saying to the Arts Council and the funders of the art, you know, what are you doing? What are you there to fund? You're not there. I mean, when I was on the Arts Council, the question I used to ask people is, would we have funded Leni Riefenstahl? Now, you know, you can't argue that, I mean, Leni Riefenstahl was an astonishing filmmaker. The fact that I disagree with, you know, what she chose to support in her films, it seems to me a separate question. I was asked to be part of when that trans novel got put on the Women's Fiction Prize list, I was asked to sign a letter, which I refused to do. And the reason I declined to do, because my reasons for signing a letter would have been, I don't think somebody born a man belongs on a women's shortlist. But the rest of the letter was about the themes of the book. And actually, I'm a bit of a free speech fundamentalist there. I said, no, I'm not prepared to say that certain books should not be published, because that's what's causing a problem in publishing at the moment. So I think the practical answer to this, and I've just done some work in one university with one big department, which is it's a big school and it's got 3 departments in it. And one of the departments is a humanities department and one of the departments is a business department. And they don't agree about much in terms of how they see the world. And I do this bit of work where I help people to construct their diversity framework. In other words, back to, you know, the English language not written in English, not written in the English language and so on. So what I've done with them is that the diversity framework I've written is basically says, we don't agree about much. Therefore, our diversity framework is precisely creating the space in which that agreement can be done well. And that we accept that actually that is at the core of a university's job, is that the exchange of ideas and not a sort of agreement. You know, that's a fundamental part of what we do. And I've tried to construct something for them which flows from the strength of that. So I think that's a way of doing it. I mean, it was quite interesting in this moment, I won't mention it, but I mean, I was called up by one of the humanities people who demanded a statement of my position on something. And basically said, you know, if you cannot give me this statement, you know, our conversation is at an end. And I did say to his boss, I don't think this person should be anywhere near young people.
Yeah.
You know, this seems to me to be entirely antithetical to what their function is in life. So I think, Rosie, the thing that we've got to do is keep alive the purpose of the art. And the purpose of the art is precisely to expose you to things you don't know, don't understand, don't get on. And if you don't like it, leave. It's not hard. You know, I mean, you know, and yes, so that's what I would say. That, but I think we make a virtue out of it, and then say to people that is at the core of what you do. Again, thank you for that letter. Though it was essay. It was fantastic.
That was very, very powerful. What you just said there, Simon. I think we've got room for maybe one or two more.
Sorry, I'm wittering on.
No, I'm just trying to make sure a few people get their voices in. That's all. We got.
Hi there, Simon. Thanks for your talk. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
Coming back to the issue of why is this happening now?
Oh yes.
And one of the things that is often comes out of academia is post-structuralism, and the whole idea that there's only representations, there's no reality anymore, that knowledge is unstable, everything's contingent on everything else. It's all about language. Do you cover this in your book at all? And do you think that that post-structuralism and this kind of way of thinking is influential in creating this phenomenon?
I do. I mean, that's really what I mean, I suppose, when I talk about the triumph of the subjective. And it is interesting. I don't know what your discipline is, but it is interesting talking to scientists who deal in very material things. And I mean, I was talking to a mathematician the other day, and he was very funny about it because he said, one of the things about mathematicians is we don't really argue about anything. What we argue about is what's worth studying, but we don't argue about the answers because there are answers. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. So, you know, in certain debates and in science and so on and so forth, you know, you find that actually those people who are committed to notions of material reality, you know, there's actually a chemical here or an atom there or whatever it is in the next place. You know, that seems to me to be very powerful. And the idea that you can simply rewrite, it's this distinction between creating the world and describing the world. You can describe the world with language, but it does seem to me you can't create a different material reality with language, because what you're asking people to do is, it's like being in an Escher drawing. You are completely, but that's the point of it. So I think it does play a very powerful role, but it's dressed up as we must respect people's identity. Well, must we? I mean, is that a truth? Should we always respect what people say they are? I don't think that is necessarily true, because if you're a liar, or if you're a cheat, or if you're, you know, dishonest or lack integrity, should we respect that? No, I don't think so. I don't think we should respect everything irrespective. I think we should bring a critical faculty to it. And, you know, I have a particular, I mean, in the trans question, I mean, I say that it seems to me there are three elements of it. One is biology, and that is a material reality, and there's a binary to that. The second is law and policy. And, you know, without wanting to be extreme about it, rights are not immutable. They are not without contradiction. They are precisely contestable. And I use an example, it's a bit extreme in the book, but, you know, when the Taliban got on the bus at the Swat Valley and said, who is Malala? And they went, she is, and then they shot her. You know, she was pursuing her United Nations Charter of Human Rights, right to girls' education. They were pursuing their right to religious expression. And I think rather obviously these two things clash. You know, similarly with the cartoons in, you know, in not Kaleidoscope, whatever it was, the French magazine, and so on. So in law and policy, in order to reach good solutions, there has to be dialogue. I mean, there's simply no way. We all know what happens with rush legislation, and you can see it around the conversion therapy thing. If you can define that, then fine. But if you can't define it, then in which case, don't let's rush into legislation. So there's a whole questions around law and policy which precisely demand dialogue. And the third thing is social recognition, which is different again. And I just use a story. There's a lovely trans activist that I know called Jackie Gavin. And I met her years ago when she was in the civil service. And Jackie was Scott before she was Jackie. And you need to know that for this story. And I did I've done lots of panels with Jackie, but I did a panel with Jackie about 4 years ago. And we chatted. I said my bit, she did her bit. And we talked to each other because we were interested in what each other said. And then threw it open like this to the floor. And about the third question was a woman who said, I don't understand all this misgendering and dead naming and blah, blah, blah. And what to do about it. And Jackie, who's very funny and Glaswegian, leapt forward and she said to this young woman, she said, well, first thing, dear, she said, is just calm down. She said, just ask. And this woman was like, oh, okay. And then she said this fantastic thing. She said, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Scott's bravery. He's part of me and I carry him with me everywhere I go. And you could feel in the room this extraordinary sense of relaxation as she let people into her story. And the other day on, Trans Day of Visibility, it's always International Day of something, isn't it? The Veruca or whatever. And that one keeps on coming back. Sorry, bad joke. What did Jackie put on? She put on 4 photographs. Scott when he was about 8, Scott when he was about 17, her in the 80s with the most shocking perm and Lady Diana dress, and then her now as a rather elegant 50-year-old. She put all 4 photographs on. She told her story. And what I love about that is that is precise. It's the glory of the difference of the story. It's the richness of that, rather than trying to use language in order to coerce people into homogeneity, that in the end puts me in the position that I'm in. This is where I want to be. I want to be in a position where, that's why the book's called what it's called, but that's where I want to be. So the point you make about the difference between material reality and this idea of using language to construct the world, that's why it's so profoundly destructive, I think, rather than constructive. And it's not about respect for other people. If you really respected other people, you'd respect their difference, not try and make them same.
Thank you, Simon.
Sorry, that was me on a soapbox, beg pardon.
No, that was good, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, Jessica. It's so funny, the mute button. I've had this thing during Zooms. You can tell I talk a lot. And when people have been saying, oh, you're on mute, I've suddenly realised that actually people have wanted that button for me all my life.
Don't let it stop you. And we are exactly on our time boundary, which is 3 o'clock. It's been an exhilarating ride, actually, through lots of ideas and thoughts, and it's certainly enlarged the diversity of thinking in my own mind, which is really all you could ask for.
Well, if
thank you so much. Maybe
absolutely.
We'll have you back.
Well, 2 things to say, really. One is that, without wanting to sound fawning, and I hope I didn't to Rosie, but I mean, it's so impressive what you've done and to get through the barriers that I know you've had to get through to create this network. So that's fantastic. And I think it gives strength I know it gives strength to other people, which is terrific. And tell you what, the Vice Chancellor, when I was Chairman of Sussex, and I are very great friends, as you can imagine, having spent 6 years working together. And we often discuss what happened to Kathleen would not have happened if we had been Chairman and Vice Chancellor. But what I would say is that if you think there's, I'd be delighted, and I know John has had some thoughts on this. If you think there's a way of having a conversation and a dialogue with the university administration and seeing how we can make this work institutionally and help to stimulate, and the sort of things that Rosie and I was saying, creating these frameworks for the exchange of ideas. If you think I can help in that, obviously, I mean, without wanting to pitch myself for work, do get in touch, because I think these ideas are that's really why I care about it. And I care about it at universities because actually it's fundamental to the core of your purpose.
Yeah, well said, absolutely. Lovely, thank you very much. I will close the session.
Can I just say before you sign off, sorry, yes, sorry. Our next 2 seminars, we've got 2 coming up in close succession. We have on the 17th of May, Dr. Lisa Littman talking about detransition and gender medicine. That's at 2 o'clock and online. And on the succeeding Tuesday, that's Tuesday the 24th, Mary Leng, who's Professor of Philosophy at the University of York, will be talking about silencing and gender critical speech. If you are on our mailing list, you will get details of these. If you are not on our mailing list, chase us and get on our mailing list. Okay, did you get that?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry.
I'd be delighted to be on your mailing list.
Can I ask who to contact to get on the mailing list,
me,
please?
Or can people hear?
If you contact any of the emails, we will find you. I can't check right now, but if you
Sound
contact
like Liam Neeson.
any of the emails that you've had about this seminar, we'll get you on the mailing list.
So to find the details, the details on the Eventbrite page have a link to our website, and on the home page of the website is an email address.
Fantastic. Well, could you put me on the mailing list? This sounds fascinating stuff. I'd love to listen. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Nice picture behind. I'm liking the boats.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay, that's great.
Thanks.
Shall we close there then? Thank you everybody for your contributions and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking me.
Thanks,
Bye bye.
everyone. Thanks, Simon.